Good morning, everyone. I'm Kelly Kolar, President and founder of Kolar Design and the Kolar Design Experience Institute. Thrilled here today to be talking with you on the Right to Win Cities initiative. How do cities innovate? How do we build regional alliances? I want to kick it off first by thanking Frost Brown Todd, Project Finance Advisors, as well as Red Tiger Innovation for being our key sponsors today, of our panelists. And we're super excited to share everything that we're going to learn about as we look at what the future holds in a post-pandemic world. So let's go ahead and get started. The Kolar Experience Institute is built upon building research and insights, focused on exploring that intersection of people, process, and place, and how do we create positive impact for clients as well as communities. Many of us here have been working in the public sector for 30 years, as well as the private sector. So looking forward to learning today about the partnerships, the collaborations, and innovation.gov as we look at the future. Where did this all start? You can see in the next slide here that this actually started, of course, at the beginning of the 15-day to now 15-month shutdown in 2020. That's where I had the privilege and honor of meeting the A team down on the bottom right of our screen with Bruce Katz, as well as with Peg Moertl, Francis Kern-Manone, myself, and David Rogers, as we began to look at a call for Main Street Regenerators. And today we have an esteemed panel to talk about why are Main Street Regenerators and alliances needed across America. That led us to an exploration and a discovery and a sprint process to build what does it look like in the future. And now where are we today? How does the model expand in our city as well as in other cities across America? That's what the focus of the topic is going to be. But remember now, as we're coming out now of the pandemic, the next slide, the big question that's on the table still today as we look at government funding and we look at strategies and we look at people returning to work and reopening their offices and their shops, how do you actually recover from any type of pandemic, whether it's a natural disaster, a health pandemic, or also the equity crisis that happened in our community across the United States? These are some of the things that we're going to discover and discuss today with this great panel. So I want to thank again, in the next slide, you'll see all of our panelists and our Right to Win Cities initiative. We're coming together about helping our regions recover and build their right to win. We have Bruce Katz with us today, Director of Nowak Metro Finance Lab at Drexel University. Been working with Bruce for the past year on all of these strategies. Can't wait to hear what's happening across the nation. We also have Peg Moertl, the Executive Director of the Greater Cincinnati Regeneration Alliance, one of the newest initiatives in the region and in the town. We can't wait to hear about what's happening here within Cincinnati and around. And then, of course, we have David Rogers, the project finance attorney, who's a specialist in building out strategies, and we need the legal advice, the continued partnership as we look forward at building any public-private finance strategy. So super excited, David, to have you as a sponsor, as well as Sean Ballness, who's on the call as well from Red Tiger Investments. Glad to have both of you with us and partners in the Right to Win Cities consortium that we're building. So I'm going to let each of the panelists introduce themselves and talk a little bit about what they've been up to in the last few months related to the pandemic, and what do they see as the future. Bruce, we'll let you start with your introduction.
Well, thanks, Kelly. It's great to be with everyone. I'm actually in Dayton today, having spent time at the Dayton Arcade yesterday. So I run the Nowak Metro Finance Lab at Drexel University, and really for the past year, working with a broad network of partners around the country, have been looking at essentially the small business crisis that has emerged in general from the pandemic, which had a devastating effect on businesses in various sectors of our economy because of the lockdown, but also on the commercial corridors, business districts, and main streets, where many of these businesses tend to congregate and co-locate. A particular focus on the disproportionate impact, the disparate impact of the pandemic on Black and Brown-owned businesses because of their fragility, lack of connections to the financial mainstream, and their concentration in sectors like childcare, which were particularly hard hit. So looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. All right. Peg?
Peg, you're muted.
we'll go to David next for his introduction, and then we'll come back to you, Peg.
Thank you. David Rogers. I'm a public and project finance attorney for several decades, also a registered municipal advisor with a Series 50 license from the SEC. Really happy to be working on Right to Win and with KEI on these informational webinars. We've been concentrating since the pandemic on trying to figure out initially how to use CARES Act money and now how to use American Rescue Plan Act money to not only replace funds that were lost, but also to use them for a permitted purpose, which is to help with economic stimulus matters. And nationwide, people are really asking all the time, cities, me and other organizations, including their trade associations like the National League of Cities and the Conference of Mayors, what can I use the money for? And the answer is there's Treasury regulations that give you guidance, but there's probably more flexibility than everybody knows about. That's one reason I'm happy to be speaking today, so that we can talk about collaborative efforts to use some of that extra money if you think you can use it to help rebuild the economies, especially the Main Street economies and similar neighborhoods. Thank you.
Fantastic. All right, and Peg, you're back.
Great. Yeah, thanks for allowing me to unmute. I'm a 45-year veteran of community economic development and affordable housing, and recently formed my own firm, Grovedale Consulting. And through that, I'm now the director of the Greater Cincinnati Regeneration Alliance, which built on the work that several of you started 15 months ago to specifically look at ways in which we might accelerate the recovery of commercial corridors and business districts in neighborhoods with a focus on Black, brown, women-owned businesses, and bring vitality back to our neighborhoods, build on the local economy, and build more equitable, inclusive communities while we're at it. So it's kind of a big charge, but a lot of interesting work going on. Thanks.
What a great culmination for your career, Peg, and congratulations on your new business. Welcome to the world of entrepreneurship. Of course, I love talking about that. And of course, also being another woman-owned business and all the work that I know we've done together with the Urban League. It's so great to see you also take on this charge for our region. So congratulations, and can't wait to hear about what you're thinking. Last, I want to introduce Sean Baldwin. Sean is our sponsor today from Red Tiger Investments. Sean, would you like to introduce a little bit about you and your role in the consortium and what you've done? And he's on mute too. So there you go.
There we go. Hi, yeah, Sean Bonus, the founder of Red Tiger. We focus on real estate projects that can be catalysts for economic development. And so often that focus is really determining where a municipality from an industry standpoint has a right to win. So looking forward to participating in the discussion today. Thank you.
Fantastic. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started with our first question. So it's going to be very, very informal. And so again, to our attendees, thank you so much for attending. Please be sure to put your questions in the chat throughout the discussion. We can address them as we go because we've got a really robust conversation. And we want to really, really understand from you what your needs are as well, since we know we have a very diverse audience, from city administrators to developers to business owners as well, as people that are growing initiatives through their nonprofit organizations in their own region. So let's go ahead and get started. So how do you actually help cities develop their priorities? And I want to throw this question first to Bruce. Just talking big picture, I know you're working across the nation. Tell us a little bit about that, and what's the work that Nowak does, and how do you see yourself partnering with local organizations?
Well, thanks, Kelly. First of all, just a bit of context. We're at the beginning really of a multi-act play with large amounts of federal investment. The enactment of the American Rescue Plan in March, $1.9 trillion. There's going to be followed by, hopefully, the passage of a $250 billion U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, and then by an American Jobs Plan with a substantial investment in infrastructure. So there's a large focus in the media, obviously, on trillions of dollars that are being invested by the national government. At the end of the day, the federal government may invest, but cities are the ones that actually set priorities, design strategies, and execute and deliver. So what we're doing is working with cities around the country, particularly Accelerator for America, a group co-founded by Mayor Eric Garcetti of Los Angeles, with a small cohort of cities, including Dayton, on setting up stimulus command centers. Because ultimately, cities need an inside game within government, within the public sector, and an outside game with private, civic, university, and other leaders to set clear priorities so that they can match local uses, essentially, to these large federal sources. To some extent, to be frank, the pandemic has set the priorities because the pandemic has had this disparate effect on small business. It's obviously had some devastating effect on housing, on homelessness. So cities around the country, I'm seeing sort of a common focus on those areas and several others. But what we're just beginning to see is this deployment of federal funds in the service of transformative local vision.
Fantastic. And then as we look at the priorities, I love what you said about how the pandemic kind of set the priorities in place because of what happened. And now we're in this recovery and rebuild, renew, and then the localization of that. But obviously, the government needs support in the legal aspects of this. So David, tell us a little bit about the role of firms like Frost Brown Todd and how do you help cities look at their priorities through this lens of the legal aspects of going from that federal to local, as Bruce talked?
Well, as I mentioned earlier in the introduction, what we've seen is lots of cities going directly to the federal government and saying, I've had my legal staff read the regulations, and then we have questions, can we use the money for this particular purpose? And that's probably not the way I would recommend doing it. And I've also talked to people in national trade associations who say they're getting calls saying, when you call the federal government, the answer is no, no, maybe, no, no. And so I think the answer is to work with your municipal advisors and work with your finance council that has dealt with grants from federal governments in the past and use them in ways that are more creative. And so I know that many cities are RFPing, many are forming committees, and those are all well and good. But it's also important to recognize that if you have an advocate, that could be a financial advisor or a municipal advisor or potentially legal counsel, they can help you structure this in a way that you think will comply with the regulations. In addition, I did want to mention that one of the ways that folks can get money is to replace revenue that they can qualify for expenditures of their American Rescue Plan Act funds by replacing revenue that was lost. And in the meeting just yesterday, I heard someone say, our city can qualify for all of the money that has been allocated to us to spend it to recover lost revenues, but it's a 4-year payout. Well, if you might consider using some of your money as under that category of replacing lost revenues, then you'll have money in your pocket, and then you can ask a question which is totally unrelated to the American Rescue Plan Act and totally unrelated to what the federal regulations say. It's now your money because it's replaced lost revenue, and you can figure out how you can use it creatively for the purposes you want to use it for, including potentially the economic development purposes and helping renovate and re-energize your Main Street corridors. So what we see is collaboration more than ever before. I know Bruce has mentioned this many times, and that's a really good thing that's come out of this, because we've always thought that collaboration among governmental entities that have money together with nonprofits that may work with them, or special purpose entities like economic development finance organizations. In Ohio, we call them port authorities. In other states, they may be called industrial development authorities. But those people can all also use your funds, and they can use them in creative ways then that maybe qualify under the federal law. So ask questions, maybe first figure out how would you like to use the money. Don't read the federal regulations. Ask yourself, how would I like to use the money? And then try to get the expertise available to see if you can use it that way.
That's great, David. Sean, why don't you talk a little bit? I know last month's webinar we had on Mayor DeBrosi from the City of Montgomery and BJ Jetter, City Administrator, and Alan Freeman from Pierce Township. Talk a little bit about, what do you see as ways for cities to transform? Peg's going to talk about the alliances in a minute and about building this ecosystem, but why don't you talk a little bit about some of the funding strategies of how you've helped those cities or municipalities or townships use funding?
So great. I think Bruce alluded to the fact that COVID really has changed everything. So I think step number one for many of these municipalities is begin to do an audit of your existing strategic plans, comprehensive plans. And if you haven't already started to determine how COVID has impacted your business districts, you have to do that and use that information to begin updating your existing plans. And that could be your economic development strategy, comprehensive plan. But also, while doing that, begin to identify state and local incentives that are already existing that potentially could be coupled along with the ARP money as more details come out on what you can and can't use that money for.
Great, excellent. Well, I'm so, you see the cities that already have the CARES funding. A lot of people, a lot of municipalities we worked with, you can only buy so many fire trucks. You can only buy so much, PPP. But it would be great if we could look at, ways that they, as Bruce said, this is the first act in a many act play coming. And so we've got to start to think strategically with our cities and within our communities about what are the priorities and where is the highest need. And I love this idea of this innovation platform. Bruce talked about U.S. innovation and, competitions coming. And I think, the city of Cincinnati with Mayor Bloomberg grant, with the Bloomberg grant, we just applied. We were not successful in qualifying for that $1 million grant with the Hale Foundation and several other nonprofit institutions. But, it would be just so great if there's going to be more of these types of competitions in competitive cities and more access to money for cities to be able to win and build their right to win. So I realize it looks like we're still having a little bit of mute challenge. So I'm going to make sure that Audrey unmutes all the panelists. So don't put yourself back on mute because I think somehow it seems to be locking us in. But of course we can prioritize that. Let's go to the next question, Peg, and then there you are now. You're unmuted. There you go. Next question, because Peg, I think you're leading us on this question. What are your thoughts on the private sector partnerships and working with funds even outside of this ARP or this the first, second, and third act that Bruce is talking about?
Yeah, I think that there's a tremendous opportunity to leverage the money that's available and well beyond ARP, but also in pockets beyond the local allocations of ARP money. So first of all, public-private partnerships are essential. Never truer than today, when all of us are needed. All our skills, experiences, perspectives are needed to help with recovery, and particularly equitable recovery. There's an opportunity for multi-sector partnerships. That's really what the Alliance is about. So bringing together small business development organizations and place-based organizations and philanthropy, as well as government and private corporations. A lot of large corporations have made commitments to equity and recovery through their philanthropic arms or as companies. We need to be really alert and creative about all of that. And frankly, we need to think big. There is an opportunity to not spread this resource like peanut butter, but to leverage all these different resources, knit them together in new and creative ways. And I think as community leaders, whether we're elected, appointed, or engaged citizens, it's incumbent on us to think a little bigger and a little more strategically. Otherwise, we're going to waste this opportunity, and that would be a dreadful shame. And I think that there's, what we're trying to do in Cincinnati is really work hard with our local community leaders to understand specifically where are direct opportunities for intervention by bringing together this intersection of small business, the small business ecosystem, and the place-based folks, the folks who are aware of where the real estate is in commercial corridors and business districts that really could be brought to life. It may have gone dark during the pandemic. And similar, and where the businesses are that might have not quite survived, or might still be hanging on by a thread, and where they might be able to be helped and become new and vibrant partners in neighborhood business districts and commercial corridors. And again, looking to do that with an eye toward equity. How can we really focus on helping to make sure that the Black and Brown-owned businesses in our communities who've been disparately impacted, as Bruce said, by the pandemic, and by some of the earlier relief efforts, where can we bring them in? So I think there's just a tremendous opportunity if we think about it in the right way. And if we get, for me, I believe that we need to keep the end in mind and not focus so much on what's in it for me. I think sometimes with all the money that's becoming available through the government, sometimes that brings us back into being in competition with one another over those resources, or maybe thinking just about what our narrow focus is. But if we have a common community strategy, and we keep in mind, like, what's the best way to get there, it really creates opportunities for new kinds of partnerships and collaborations among all these different stakeholders in a positive community outcome.
Fantastic. Peg, I love that idea of that common community strategy. I mean, being in the small business ecosystem myself, and I know many of us here are, I love that. How are we connected, and how are we contributing to the fabric of the community, and how is the fabric of the community woven into us and our businesses?
Yeah, and I think as an example, the Greater Cincinnati Regeneration Alliance, the founding primary five partners who are the steering team for the Alliance include that kind of multi-stakeholder, our example of that kind of multi-stakeholder team. It's Jeannie Gallagher, who's the CEO of a local CDFI, real estate CDFI. And again, that's another place to look. I mean, CDFI has just got a big chunk of relief money, and there's more out there. Fifth Third Bank, so a large regional bank, a senior executive there. Senior executive with a local foundation, the Hale Foundation, the CEO of the Urban League, president CEO of the Urban League here, and the CEO of the Port Authority, the local economic development finance agency. So that's a pretty powerful team, and even just in working together over the last year to sort of build this strategy, they've begun to build partnerships among themselves in new ways, and that's pretty exciting.
Fantastic. And I know since we worked on that innovation with those initial partners coming out, you mentioned this place-based strategies, and it's really all about creating a better place. And that was one of the biggest pieces that came out of the work with Bruce, was connecting the dots, literally with, the civic need, the community strategy, as you talked, the place, making this place a better place, physically, digitally, ecologically, economically, as our overall wellness strategy. Later on, I want to circle back and ask you about some really significant catalytic projects that are happening in the region. We've been working on the critical care building for 5+ years with Cincinnati Children's Hospital in Avondale, and just the goal and the role of what does something like that, along with the innovation districts that Bruce is talking about, with all the work that Beth Robinson and the team is doing up there in our innovation district, what an unbelievable catalytic platform for our future here in the region. So can't wait to hear from both of you about innovation on that side, as well as what can we do here in Cincinnati? Where are we seeing already these clusters of innovation like you've already started? So next is, let's go to David, again, on the public-private partnership. David, give us some insights on the aspects of what does this look like from a legal perspective, and how do we help businesses and communities come together?
And if I could interrupt, Kelly, just 1 second, Bruce needs to be unmuted so he can chime in on the conversation.
Great.
Well, what I was going to mention was that the phrase public-private partnership has developed over time, and sometimes means relationships that are contractual, and public entities like cities have in the past been contracting for private services a lot. It's come to mean two things. One of them is really getting the private sector to come in and help participate in solving the needs of the city governments. And maybe they participate by a contract where they may demand less in fees or provide some other benefits to the cities they don't normally demand to other private contracting parties. It also means ways to join together with potentially the private sector as well as other public sector entities so that you could figure out a creative way to spend monies. I'll just mention that in Ohio, if you do a survey, what you find out is that Ohio does not have a public-private partnership statute. That's what the lawyers say, what the surveys say, except if you're at the Ohio Department of Transportation, which has one. There's one in the legislature right now being considered, but that's actually not the inside baseball. Inside baseball is that those economic development entities called port authorities in Ohio, and many of them exist where there's no port, that's a physical port. They have the powers to be developers, and because they have the power to be developers, they can do anything that a private developer can do to create new jobs and employment opportunities and help revitalize communities, including businesses for people that we're trying to target to help with business revitalization. And then there's a strange little quirk of Ohio law that says they can cooperate and create joint ventures with cities, and the city and the port can share those development powers. Now, obviously, there's a political challenge to decide what a city would like to do, how much it would like to get into the business of being a developer. But if you start from the proposition that in your state, a public-private partnership might be actually not just public-private, but it might be public-public, and you might be able to have a bunch of economic development powers you don't normally use.
Yeah.
Years ago, cities would say they had home rule power to do anything, but that's been chipped away by the courts. Now you can gather more of that power back, and you can do it in many other jurisdictions. So what we find is that, once again, as I said earlier, talking to people who are in fact experts in the area, whether they're bankers, advisors, or potentially legal counsel, will get you an opportunity to at least ask questions and get them answered. As Sean mentioned earlier, look at your strategic plans. What do you want to do? Well, after you do that, you may want to even think outside the box and think, how can I expand my strategic plan? And I did want to say this again, and I know Peg has seen this, I know Bruce has seen this. There's been a lot of resistance because it's my turf, it's my territory among political subdivisions around the country when it comes to how should I cooperate with other folks, including the private sector and including political subdivisions. But the recession in 2009, 8, 9, and 10, and now the pandemic have all taught us that we're in this all together.
Yeah.
And so we really need to figure out ways to cooperate with each other. And so that's one unintentional but exciting consequence of the pandemic.
Fantastic. Sean, do you have anything to add about the CICs and what you've been doing with some smaller municipalities?
Yeah, so I work with many of the second ring and third ring municipalities, and a lot of them use their community improvement corporations to effectively, in a way, act like some of the ports act with the bigger cities. And the ones that are most effective are the ones that have a really good balance of you have the public, but good private sector participation that brings good private sector experience. And then another thing I'd mention is with a lot of these municipalities, when looking at what types of companies they want to recruit, I'm a big proponent for look at the startups in the stage 2 companies within your region, and especially those that are linked to the emerging industries. Because when you look at what the state and the Fed typically want to invest in, it's the emerging industries, things like advanced manufacturing, cybersecurity, and so forth. So, everybody wants the next Amazon. But with the one thing you can somewhat control is looking and understanding what those the stage 2 companies within your region that are growing, those I suggest going out and trying to recruit for your municipality because you can effectively grow with them.
Fantastic. Looks like Bruce is having some challenges a little bit with his audio, but maybe he can chime in on the innovation platform and even the Dayton Arcade project, which you said was the most innovative, prolific, mixed-use redevelopment project that you saw in the nation at one point. And last night it opened, and they've been opening, and they're a cross section of innovation and education, etc. So tell us what you see on the innovation side, Bruce.
Yeah, and I'm sorry about the noise outside the hotel if it's disrupting folks from hearing. I mean, the bottom line is we're going to see trillions of dollars coming in from the national government. And I think the test for cities is, are you going to be using funds, braiding and blending funds? There's ultimately going to be funding across hundreds of programs because the federal government operates in sort of vertical silos. They have a program for just about everything, or a product for just about everything. Cities act as horizontal entities. They really look across disciplines and across activities. So the most important innovation that has to happen right now is for cities to braid and blend federal funding across multiple programs and then leverage up private and civic capital. The Dayton Arcade, which is a remarkable adaptive reuse of a historic building, which was almost sold off literally brick by brick on eBay, is an example of a place where there's obviously historic preservation, but more importantly, innovation, small business investment, commercialization of research, university engagement. There's so many different elements. And so at the end of the day, we're seeing dozens of sources, whether they're programmatic, tax incentives, and ultimately private and civic investment. So we're gonna mostly need innovations in project finance, frankly, because the most important projects, I think, for the, to change the growth trajectory of downtown Dayton or other places, will ultimately require a mastery of radically different sources for multiple purposes. So Kelly, we're at the beginning of something here. I think Dayton Arcade is an exemplar, both of what really the country should be looking to do with all this funding, but also how to do it.
Fantastic. And talk about the regional alliance and how you see this ecosystem being able to be that blender and that braider, I think, of these public-private funds. Have you talked strategically about some of the bigger initiatives that are needed here in the region?
So I think that I talked before about the intersection between the small business ecosystem and place. In many of our communities, probably most, that I've seen over many years, the small business support ecosystem operates in support of small businesses.
Right.
But generally not with regard to the places where those businesses operate. There are some exceptions. LISC, for example, does some of that cross work, but by and large, those are often separate silos and funded separately. If we start thinking about how to marry up the strategies so that we think about what are the right kinds of businesses to have in a business district and a commercial corridor, and how can we look to particularly those small business ecosystems that support Black, Brown, and women-owned businesses. How can we strategically bring those small businesses into our neighborhoods to create more equitable neighborhoods? And what we know statistically, I heard a presentation yesterday by Andrew Perry at Brookings on Black-owned businesses, particularly, or minority-owned businesses, particularly, and the fact that they do just as well. They just tend to be under-resourced. Systemic racism is a real problem, and so if we can help support those businesses to grow in our neighborhoods, we'll have a better outcome for everyone. So that's certainly one part of it. And then at another level, when we look at small businesses, the majority of Black and Brown-owned businesses and women-owned businesses as well, actually, are non-employer businesses that may only have the founder as an employee. And if those businesses want to grow, this would provide, we have the opportunity to provide more support for those businesses specifically around growth. So a little less general support and a little more specific support around growing employer businesses, growing in higher revenue sectors. I think someone mentioned, maybe Bruce, about small businesses growing in, about minority businesses tending to be focused in childcare and home health. We know statistically using data, we know that statistically in the greater Cincinnati region, minority businesses are overrepresented or over-concentrated in lower revenue sectors. So if we start strategically as a broader community, think about how we can help grow more businesses in higher revenue sectors and support those businesses in new ways. You know, those are all opportunities that we have in this moment to do that work, and that's some of what we're trying to look at the Alliance. And then the focus on anchors, and you talked about that, Kelly, with regard to the Children's Hospital and the work that Children's Hospital has done in Avondale and growing there. It really was for many years as the Children's Hospital grew in that it's, you know, one of the country's top, you know, the world's top children's hospitals. It's a phenomenal asset in our community, and it's great that they grow. They're in an urban community, a majority Black urban community. And for years, as they expanded inward with no connection to the community, no real incentive for the people who worked in that complex to interact in the community at all. By and large, didn't hire from the community. They've really, over the last several years, really made a lot of changes in that. And that's one example. And I know there are many anchor institutions across the country, some of them at that scale, some of them smaller. If you're in a smaller community, it may be a local healthcare organization, or it may be an educational institution, but those have often been anchors that have anchored innovation districts, anchored redevelopment of the communities around their campuses, large and small, and they are key investors in many of our commercial corridors and neighborhoods, and that has been true for many years, and is no less true now as we look at how we recover from the pandemic.
Fantastic. I love your link over to the Innovation District, and you know, Cincinnati Children's looking at, and Avondale looking at restoring the great streets, the infrastructure of these great streets where a lot of these small businesses, you know, like ours would populate. And so when we look at place-based strategies of infrastructure, connectivity, hike, bike, walk, wellness, mobility, how do you see, you know, whether it's in the Innovation District or it's on restoring a great street or a great business corridor, do you see other areas of opportunity for connectivity here? You know, we still have the whole I-75 corridor. So just as you're looking at that connectivity issue and you're linking business and place-based strategies, that's one of the ways that we can open up access, right? Is physically to be able to also create better connections.
Well, and I think we look at places where there's already energy. So for example, in Cincinnati, the College Hill community, due to incredible civic engagement and a lot of city dollars support, frankly, and actually a local philanthropist, they've been able to really build some real energy and maintain a lot of that energy throughout the pandemic. Their primary business district is a long commercial corridor that cuts through several communities, and right. It would be awesome. I've had conversations with the leaders of those adjacent communities, some of them outside the city, in the county, but outside the city, and talking about how there might be a way to build energy through that corridor that connects to other communities and really kind of create a halo effect, if you will, that marches up that street.
Love hearing the public-private partnerships, municipality to neighborhood, business to business. We all need now to, as you know, Bruce said, we're all in this together from the pandemic. We all need now to be able to work across the aisle, whatever those aisles are, and create better connections, right? So what a great idea. Yeah, that North College Hill to College Hill connection. And then of course we're seeing other areas like that too, Deer Park and Silverton. We're seeing, you know, other smaller municipalities and neighborhoods coming together. I mean, look what Norwood has done, right? It's amazing. All right, great. Well, let's go. Bruce, now that you're back, it sounds good. I see you're back on there. Fantastic. I would love to hear what you're seeing on a national level around, you know, this innovation.gov. And, you know, we're in our remaining 15 minutes. We don't have any questions from the panelists.
We do have one.
Oh, we have one. I see. Thank goodness. Rick Grywe has asked us. So how do you see multiple projects moving forward in cities establishing priorities, which is perfect. So I think that comes underneath that innovation piece. So Bruce, why don't you go ahead and take that question and then also talk about what are you seeing nationwide around innovation?
Well, again, we're still not in a situation where we know exactly what the federal government is going to be sending to cities. And by cities, I don't mean city governments. I mean the whole network of stakeholders in public, private, civic, university, and beyond. So I think we're in a preparing mode right now. If this was a rational system, we probably would have flooded the zone, so to speak, with planning funds for the next several years, particularly with regard to energy transition, economic restructuring, inclusive growth. We're going from scarcity to abundance. The federal government has been a fairly dysfunctional entity for quite some time. They've lost capacity within many of their agencies. So I think we're still in a transition period here where cities are trying to get their act together and get ready for multiple sources of funds. And this is why these public-private or private-public networks are so critical. And I think you're going to see some first movers. In Philadelphia, business leaders, labor leaders have been meeting literally every weekend to discuss key priorities for the city in collaboration with the mayor and the city council and the governor. That has really borne some fruit already because we were able to get pro bono help from McKinsey to look at supplier diversity in our public authorities, given all this infrastructure spending. So Philly's getting ready. It's getting ready to sort of bend to spend infrastructure money in the service of growing Black and brown-owned business. Tulsa, Oklahoma has merged multiple authorities, parking, redevelopment, industrial, creating a new authority for economic opportunity, which will basically catalyze the renewal of Greenwood, which is the site of the 1921 race massacre. Buffalo is an East Side initiative underway for years, fueled by state investment. They're now looking to double, triple down with federal funding. So we're seeing a lot of early first movers around, and particularly around stimulus command centers and getting your arms around this. But I think by the end of the summer and the early fall, we'll finally understand really what the federal government is sending, and we'll see how this play ends, because we're still not totally sure. And then we're into the true period of delivery and execution.
Fantastic. And that's where you see, that's why another reason why you're saying about this first act. Luckily, we do have this pause time where there's preparation and planning. Planning is really, really needed, whether it's working with our planning schools and our universities and our the private community of planning and urban planning, or we're planning our economics and our alliances as PEG is doing, working with all of those early adopters. I mean, how fantastic that these cities that you're working with, are looking for this blended to spend and bend to spend kind of model. That's back to that braiding concept again. So it sounds like, to answer Rick's question, how do you see multiple projects moving forward in cities establishing those priorities? It sounds like the answer is through the partnership and creating a strategy and getting a really good plan in place to develop those priorities. All right, fantastic. We have another question in the chat here. As city leaders focus on the impact of COVID on small businesses, primarily restaurant and bars, food and beverage, residential needs are overlooked. An example is using public dollars to expand seating into the streets. Are you seeing examples of community engagement around these issues? Seems to rush to solutions without full consideration on the impact of all stakeholders. So we did see, especially in our city, the streeteries come to life. I'm sure, Bruce, you've been seeing those all around the nation. So I'm just curious about the priorities of the early monies and where they chose to spend those versus looking really at the residential opportunities. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think cities, the funding that everyone's been focusing on with regard to city government is the flexible aid that they receive from the national government that David talked about before. And different cities have different fiscal conditions. All right. So in many cities, particularly some of the bigger cities like Philly and Detroit, a good portion of those funds need to be put towards hiring back employees that might have been furloughed or laid off, keeping city services going. So I don't see yet, frankly, a norm emerging around ecosystem building, for example, for small business or new kinds of products. I mean, all the federal small business products, Paycheck Protection Program, restaurant shutter venues, they're pretty much gone.
Yeah.
So I think we're not quite at a point where we could say, here's the routine that's emerging. I think we'll be there in several months. It will require, I think, the Biden administration to be more helpful in trying to illuminate examples, that proven examples or leading examples. I mean, but they're still in the business of trying to get all this enacted and passed and the guidance provided.
Right.
So, I think for cities, the most important thing now is to assert your priorities, declare them, concretize them, get your strategies to be actionable, crowd out some of the noise, I suppose, both outside my hotel room and elsewhere. But I think by early fall, we'll be in a situation of really saying, okay, here are 3 models that can be adapted from place to place.
Fantastic. So that infrastructure piece is going to be critical as well, it sounds like.
Absolutely.
And
Right.
the increasing conversation around housing as a part of infrastructure, Bruce, where are you seeing that? I mean, I know that the neighborhood tax credit has come up in the context of the infrastructure conversation. I think that's certainly something that would be helpful to communities, and the whole conversation around affordable housing and workforce housing, and meeting the need for that. That's, the need has gotten worse as a result of the pandemic. So there's a clear connection. What are you seeing there? If you don't mind my asking.
On the housing front.
Yeah.
This is literally day to day right now. There are changes about eviction policy.
Yeah.
You see states like California taking very assertive action. I don't think we can be Pollyannish about this right now. I think homelessness is on the rise in major cities. There's a lot of pain out there, and there's I think enhanced unaffordability of housing. And so, what we have are some early moves in the American Rescue Plan and going back to the CARES Act, scenario from last year. But the big act is going to be whether housing is counted as infrastructure in the American Jobs Plan. I actually think one of the issues that we're going to have to deal with, which doesn't get as much play as it should, is whether we're going to be really focusing on community wealth, asset building, wealth building as the North Star of these different efforts. The black-white homeownership gap in the United States is worse today than in 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed. The movement of black-owned business in the United States, the share of employer firms, it's barely budged in the last 25 years. I think we have some really critical, related issues, housing and business ownership. They're fundamentally related. And I don't think we yet see the roadmap for that, the path for that. We see it. We see the volume of the need,
Right.
but not yet, investments or strategies that match it on the wealth building side. So, again, I think for everyone on this call, this is a time to get prepared in an uncertain period, and try to assert again priorities that are really customized to place.
Fantastic. Love that.
Kelly, what I wanted to mention was we should not forget non-American Rescue Plan Act sources of funds that might assist in projects.
Right.
As we plan for those monies, there are still your TIF, your special assessment, your tax abatements, your new market tax credits, your state tax credits, your historic tax credits, other methodologies that can provide for economic development assistance and potentially help get a project if not all the way there, part of the way there. And so building that so-called capital stack and still making those plans is probably a good idea. And that, of course, will allow more flexibility for cities as they decide, once we get to the fall or later when we have more direction from the federal government, where their funds are needed. It is probably the bane of my existence as a public and project finance attorney, but during the last recession in 2010, there was a project in Cleveland that was financed with 35 sources. Now,
Wow.
I wanted to mention, when you talk about innovation, that those sources also included governmental entities promising to, subject to appropriation, if they had sufficient monies, and maybe they'll have future American Rescue Plan Act monies, subject to appropriation, saying if there's a funding gap, if there's a source of monies in this capital stack that goes close to not being positive and being negative, we will consider replenishment. Now, that's a real obligation. It's a so-called moral obligation, but for your financial purposes, for rating purposes, it's something you have to consider. But cities can help do this development with some of their resources that they don't normally think about using, because the people that rate their bonds, for example, think that they should be involved in economic development. They should be involved in renovating, replenishing, and restoring their neighborhoods and their main street corridors and their economic activity. They don't think they should be hoarding their cash and keeping it in reserve in a rainy day fund. They think they should be deploying it in a reasonable manner, always, planning to keep sufficient monies in reserve. But if you sit on all your money, eventually someone who rates your city as either a great place to live or a great place to work or a great place to learn, or rating it as to what its economic status is, will say, well, the city has not been innovative. And so an innovation frequently means just doing something that's been done before, but finding out about it and then saying, will that work in my city?
Great, David. What a great way to end our question and our panelists. I want to thank each of you as our doers and our dreamers, our designers, our early adopters, all the people that are on this call, which I know are already thinking about ways that they can help their community, whether it's their neighbor to neighbor, a business owner that they know, or being a part of the GCRA, or looking nationally at where they can add value. I want to thank everyone so much. And our gift to you will be not only, of course, a recording of this conversation and all the assets that were mentioned, but also free consultation with our Right to Win team here, our new consortium that we have just founded with David Rogers and Sean Ballness from Frost Todd Project Advisors, Red Tiger Innovation, myself, as well as a few others in our new cohort. So excited to be looking ahead, and everyone please be sure to click if you'd like to have a free 30-minute meeting with any one of us, and we can also get access and get you contact as well to our guests. Thank you again, David Rogers, Peg Moertl, Bruce Katz, the visionary. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for helping us build our cities. Peg, thanks for taking on the charge in the region here. Cannot see this, the future is so bright and it's so thankful that we have you to do that with. So thank you again so much, and we will see you next time. We're going to be having one more webinar. It'll be next month, so we'll be talking again about regional Right to Win. Check out our website, right2wincities.com. You can have access to a lot of white papers by Bruce with the new localism. And thanks again to Drexel and the Nowak finance team and everyone there. Thanks to Frost Todd. Thanks to Red Tiger. And Peg, thanks to you, to GCRA, for all of your great partnership. And what a bright future you've all painted. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.